Well, thank you very much for coming. The floor is yours.
Thanks for having me. All right, so to begin, a few disclaimers. This is a work in progress, so bear with it. And then I'll be talking about women's liberation, but in a way about social relations, gender relations. So I do recognize that women were liberated during this time period in the 30s, 20s, in the public sphere, but I'm more focusing on gender relations, where I don't really think they are. Cool. So first published in 1925, Fyodor Gladkov's Cement is considered a classic of Soviet socialist realism, as it came to provide a framework for all socialist realist novels. Socialist realism began to develop in the early 1920s and was officially sanctioned in 1934 as the chief artistic method in the Soviet Union. Its predominance, its continuous endorsement by the state, is due to the fact that Soviet realism, so socialist realism, taught readers how to adequately participate in Soviet society. It became a tool for constructing and reproducing Sovietness. As argued in Katerina Clark's monograph and production novel, The Soviet Novel History is Richer, a socialist realist text does just this by taking readers along on the ritualized journey of a hero that ends with political consciousness. The notion of the novel as a form of implicit social construction resonates with Benedict Anderson's theory that the novel enables readers to imagine their belongingness to the nation state. Anderson, in his book Imagined Communities, views the nation as an imagined community whereby nationalism is realized through a subject's feeling of belonging to and being part of a whole nation without actually knowing the majority of the population. As follows, the imaginary has real effects in the world without being something that is visible. Anderson recognizes literature, specifically the novel, as playing a special role in the construction of the nation state. If we read Cement with Clark and Anderson's theories in mind, we can get a better understanding of the ideological workings of the Soviet project. Interestingly, however, neither Clark nor Anderson consider women, or more generally gender, in their arguments. This creates an audible silence about the role of women in the Soviet project. By using Cement as the basis for my investigation, I seek to understand how women fit into the socialist realist production novel and more broadly into the Soviet imaginary. I build upon Anderson and Clark's theoretical insights and argue that in Cement, a man's ritualized journey to Soviet subjecthood hinges upon the objectification of woman. More generally, I show that the production of the Soviet imagined community depends on the distinct, diverging gendered paths of Soviet citizens. This interpretation contributes to our current understanding of gender roles in the Soviet society, as it is tied to nationalism and the nature of nation building in the Soviet Union. So I'll begin by providing a brief history of the woman question in the years after the 1917 revolution, to show how and why gendering subsisted in the Soviet Union. Next, I synthesize Anderson and Clark's principles and propositions. Then I rethink and nuance their approaches to take into consideration the role of women. While doing so, I will draw on Cement for evidence, which will illuminate how the novel is dependent on gender differentiations. From there, we will unravel the civic gendered pathways within Cement to prove that the Soviet imaginary relies on conventional gender constructions. On the whole, my analysis will show that women were secondary forces in the development and success of the production novel, and by extension, the Soviet imaginary. Simply put, the woman question was never solved between the years of 1917 to 1930, and arguably ever during the Soviet period, even though it was proclaimed solved in the 1930s. For their own purposes, Bolsheviks did integrate women into their political party and project, but this was not an integration that really transformed gender relations. As Elizabeth Wood, a Soviet historian, convincingly reports in the Baba and Comrade, Gender and Politics in the Revolutionary Russia, Soviet leaders were only interested in the woman question insofar as it served their own interests. They did not fully take into consideration what women themselves required in order to be truly liberated and contributing members of society. However, there were communist activists like Alexander Kollontai who fought for women's actual liberation. Nonetheless, Kollontai's efforts produced little lasting impact, as many Soviet policies on women's issues changed from decade to decade. What explains how the Bolsheviks understood the woman question? The Bolshevik interest in transforming gender relations had deep roots in 18th and 19th century dreams of westernizing and engineering human souls. In different ways, women were viewed as raw material on which aspiring reformers could work their transformations. At the same time, women were citizen mothers who could transmit a new culture to later generations. Ultimately, Wood finds that women were seen as objects for the state's manipulation. They were never fully acquired the status of subject. While women did receive more education and benefits and employment and voting rights during this period, their position in society did not radically change from time of the patriarchal imperial Russia. In other words, the status of women has not significantly changed. Gender relations remain the same. This will become all the more evident as we explore the gender roles within the Soviet imagined community. In Imagined Communities, Anderson finds literature, especially the novel, to have a distinct role in the formation of the imaginary, because these forms provided the technical means for representing the kind of imaginary community that is the nation. Anderson reasons that the form of the novel enables the reader to envision a civic form of a national community due to its ability to show interconnectivity between characters. The novel depicts characters existing simultaneously without necessarily interacting. Resultantly, readers come to imagine that they are part of a community even though they do not interact with its every person. Anderson provides a formulaic example of just this. Characters A and B are together while C and D are together. Characters A and C are together while B and D are somewhere else. Finally, D is alone, and A and B are together, and C is asleep. Anderson does note that characters B and C are women, but he does not take into consideration their gender, the role of their gender. Based on this example, it is clear how the form of the novel allows readers to understand how A, B, C, and D are connected without necessarily having face-to-face interactions, or even ever meeting each other. This notion that one imagines being a member of a community without knowing all other members is coupled with the author's means of describing national space in the novel. Anderson explains, we see national imagination at work in the movement of a solitary hero through a sociological landscape of fixity that fuses the world inside the novel with the outside world. The novel effectively traces the movement of the hero through national social geographic landscape, thereby representing the national space through novelistic form. For Anderson, the relationship between the form of the novel and the nation-state is more than just dependency. It is necessary. The novel gives form to the nation-state. From here, it is easy to see how the novel enables readers to imagine their nation through the text's ability to symbolically represent national time and space. Clark, the leading scholar of Soviet socialist realism, developed a useful formula for understanding the plot of a socialist realist novel. Significantly, she considers Cement to be the most influential text for the development of socialist realism. In her book, she explains the essential stages of the production novel and emphasizes the role of rituals in socialist realism. She writes, rituals always involve some kind of transformation. The subject of the ritual goes from one state to another, and his progress or passage enacts some central idea of the culture. The heroes of production novels are always masculine and participate in ritualized process, so they can become politically conscious Communist Party members. The hero's initial unconsciousness, understood as actions not guided by political awareness, is paramount to the plot of the novel. Clark terms a hero's unconsciousness as his spontaneity. She understands this transformation of the hero as a spontaneity consciousness dialectic. She elucidates the importance of this dialectic in the socialist realist text. The great historical drama of struggle between the forces of spontaneity and the forces of consciousness is unfolded in a tale of the way one individual mastered his willful self, became disciplined, and attained an extra-personal identity. Correspondingly, the ritual process creates a way for the hero to conquer his spontaneity, become politically conscious, and realize the Soviet principle. The production novel can only end when the hero masters his uncomfortable self and thus transforms into a loyal and active Soviet subject. So we put Clark's and Anderson's theorizations into dialogue, we arrive at a Soviet instruction manual for devising the imaginary of a Soviet society, although one that neglects the role and impact of women. How then do we go about rightfully including women into these theories? To begin, it might be useful, as Anne McClintock, a renowned scholar of gender studies, advises to consider feminist theorizations of nationalism. She explains, all nations depend on powerful constructions of gender. Despite nationalism's ideological investment in the idea of popular unity, nations have historically amounted to the sanctioned institutionalization of gender difference. No nation in the world gives women and men the same access to the rights and resources of the nation state. As McClintock suggests, there are varying standards and expectations for men and women within the national community, which is also evident in the Soviet case. To clarify what exactly is gender and how it's fabricated in patriarchal discourse, we need not look further than to Simone de Beauvoir. As Beauvoir has famously argued, one becomes a woman. She asserts, one is not born, but rather becomes woman. No biological, psychic, or economic destiny defines the figure that the human female takes on in society. It is civilization as a whole that elaborates the intermediary product between male and the eunuch that is called feminine. There is nothing uniquely feminine to the female sex, but we, as a society, make it such in our masculine discourse. She comes to formulate this notion from first understanding that woman is negative to such a point that any determination is inputted to her as a limitation, without reciprocity. She is determined and differentiated in relation to man, while he is not in relation to her. She is inessential in front of the essential. He is subject, he is the absolute, she is the other. For de Beauvoir, woman is secondary to man and all while a construction of man. She is man's object. In essence, one must fulfill certain expectations to perform in a specified manner that is predetermined by societal conventionalism. In light of these feminist insights into traditional social roles of women and men, I would like to re-theorize Anderson's model. Drawing on the example of simultaneity mentioned above, if characters B and C are women and characters A and D are men, then we come to understand their interconnectivity teaches how to imagine a gendered nation, in which being woman is a socially constructed performance that is different for man and nevertheless for man. I'll be providing an example of this soon. At this point, I'll briefly summarize cement as I will reconsider Anderson's theory in this context. It is important to note that this novel has been edited and redacted more than 20 times over the course of the Soviet Union, underlying the more progressive nature of this first edition. The novel depicts a war hero, Gleb, who returns home from Russia's civil war and is distraught over the condition of his village and his family. The town is unproductive and he is estranged from his wife, Dasha. Dasha is a liberated woman as she works outside the home for the betterment of society and supports herself. The closing of the town's cement factory, where he once worked, angers Gleb to the point that he must take action. Vowing to reopen the factory, Gleb sets out on a mission to transform the town into an ideal communist society. However, he must accept Dasha's new role and overcome the fact that she will never be his traditional wife. Additionally, he must move past his anger at Baden, a man who works at the factory and sexually assaulted Dasha and Polya, Dasha's friend and the head of the party's women's section, in order to reopen the cement factory. He has these struggles, both personal and bureaucratic, but ultimately the factory is renewed. Okay, so now we need to move. Now let us consider cement's main characters. A. Gleb, B. Dasha, C. Polya, and D. Baden, as they traverse the Soviet national space in the narrative and apply Anderson's schematic analysis to their interactions. In the beginning of the novel, A and B are in their home, where B explains to him her liberation, and C and D are alone. Then, A, B, and C are in C's office party's women's section, while D is still alone. B leaves, and A and C discuss how B will return to A as a good traditional wife. Later on, B and D are together. D forces himself on B, who rebuffs his advances. B and D are attacked by Cossacks. B martyrs herself for D because he is too useful for society, while A is in the factory and C is in her office at the Women's Committee. D then goes on to rape C, who sacrifices herself for society. A finds out that D assaulted B and C. A confronts D in the factory and wants to have him shot. B moves out of her home with A and relocates with C in order to help her overcome the trauma of being assaulted by D and allow A to complete his ritualized journey. This example epitomizes how gender affects characters' interconnectivity. A and B interact because they are married. B and C meet because they are both members of the Women's Committee. A and C encounter one another because of A's marriage to B. Finally, A and D confront one another because of D's relationships with B and C, and due to their shared association with the factory, which should be understood as man's domain and will be explained in a moment. Characters A, B, and C and D connect in particular ways dictated by their gender. As a result, readers understand how characters are bound together without having constant face-to-face interactions, and importantly, on gendered terms. Furthermore, this example gives us insight into how men are assigned a higher value in society and women are molded as lesser than men. B and C sacrifice themselves for the good of the two men and for society, as the men are more important actors. D acts on his own sexual desire because he thinks he can. He views B and C as objects for his own consumption. Lastly, A seeks to protect B and C and punish D because he senses his manhood at stake as defined in conventional terms. B and C move in together, so there is a complete separation of genders, the woman's active stance against sexual relations for the productivity of society, which will be explained in more detail soon. Likewise, national space can also be read as gendered in this novel. For instance, a house is described as woman's territory and a workplace as man's. In this way, readers identify national spaces and internalize the gendering of these spaces. A precipitous example of this can be found in cement. In the novel, there are multiple recognizable national spaces that we, as readers, come to see as male or female spheres. The factory and the creche, for example. We first see the factory as the male sphere when Gleb returns home and visits the factory office. The initial indication that this is a man's space is from the chapter title beneath, Bratva. A better English translation might be something like bros. Next, Gleb enters the factory office and becomes engulfed with a smell, which he equates with male workers. Here, where the odors of the steam bath and of strong tobacco. Amidst these fumes of dirt were men, soiled also with the gray dust of the quarries and highways, soiled as the foliage in the factory buildings. Moreover, Gleb immediately notices how all the men are sitting together with only one woman in the vicinity. The men are mocking this woman, who came to them for support. Inevitably, the male characters are defining this space as man's domain, as the woman is essentially thrust onto a metaphorical stage for man's spectacle. While their taunting is seemingly emblematic of their insecurity of the existence of a woman in the public sphere, the males clearly are visibly comfortable enough to openly ridicule this woman in the space. In a somewhat similar manner, the creche is depicted as woman's domain. This is first represented by the fact that only women work at the nursery. Then, when Gleb and Dasha visit the creche, he notices how Dasha returns to her maternal self, and he does not mention his own maternal feelings. This scene confirms that in the Soviet imaginary, parenthood was constructed differently for its citizens and essentially relied on and promoted pre-revolutionary constructs of parenting. Woman as the primary parent held responsible for child rearing, and man as biological father absolved of obligation. Moreover, the fact that this scene is narrated from the point of view of Gleb sheds light on how man's discourse literally shapes our perception of space. Man authorizes the gendering of space like he does the gendering of woman. Fundamentally, as we will see more clearly soon, Dasha's prescribed maternalism speaks to and is the woman's role in the formation of the Soviet imagined community. It's in this light I would also like to reconceptualize Clark's theorization of the production novel. Clark's quiescence about the status of women in the typical socialist realist novel suggests that these texts prioritize the male positive hero, which in and of itself speaks to the position of women. How then does women's secondary position take form in the production novel, and how did Gladkov's popular novels strive to represent women's roles in Soviet society? Thea Margaret Durfee, a scholar of Russian literature, has attempted to answer these two questions. She argues, Gladkov presented the reader with a radical, liberated woman who acted out of the left-wing Bolshevik deconstruction of the family. Even though Gladkov's vision remains limited by certain chauvinist ideals of women and beauty, the new roles he envisioned for women in political, social, and economic life reflected his attempt to embrace the most radical and progressive views in the air at the time he was writing. Part of this analysis are agreeable, but overall, Durfee is very generous with Gladkov. As already established, the novel is quite conventional in the ways it fashions societal roles for men and women. The production novel's focus on the positive hero neglects the role of women, which molds them as secondary, reaffirming and reproducing their status as other/object. How does the subservient position of women manifest in cement? Largely, we see this develop in two ways. First, we witness this in how Dasha's mere presence brings about the spontaneity Gleb must overcome in order to reach political consciousness, because communist principles are necessary in both the private and public spheres. To recall and explicate Clark's definition of spontaneity, we should understand it as a subject state or mode of relating to the world. It occurs internally within the subject, functioning as a form of interiority. Dasha's presence as a woman and mother causes Gleb to resort to and desire traditional values. He must accept that Dasha is not and cannot be the traditional wife he once had. Secondly, we observe this with how Dasha guides him throughout this process, his ritualized journey, by acting as a maternal figure. She constantly nurtures in him a communist consciousness by rebuffing his sexual advances, reminding him of communist principles, and maintaining moral steadiness. This behavior appears to be the new woman's role in the construction of the Soviet imaginary. Dasha is employed as the other for Gleb's self-construction, an accelerant for the completion of Gleb's ritualized journey. Over the course of the novel, Dasha's secondary position and role as maternal figure enable Gleb to understand and accept communist principles in both the public and private spheres. When Gleb returns home from war, he expects to find the same loving and domestic wife he left 3 years ago. But to his surprise, Dasha is a devout communist who now believes in equality between the genders and free love. Resultantly, she has moved past their traditional marriage due to its incompatibility with communist thinking. Upon his return home from war, Gleb is excited to see Dasha and embraces her. Dasha, on the other hand, is ambivalent and impersonal. She instructs Gleb to calm down and proceeds to refer to him as comrade. Gleb becomes angry and he exclaims, "What the hell do you mean, comrade? What's that? Do you think I'm a damn fool?" She responds, "I take my dinner in town in the communal restaurant of the food commissariat, and I get my bread ration from the party committee. Gleb, you better call in at the factory committee and register there for a bread card. I shall be away for 3 days. They've ordered me away to the country." Consequently, Gleb immediately assumes that Dasha must have a lover. Being a communist himself, Gleb should have anticipated or even desired a more politically conscious Dasha, but instead he is stunned, angry, and jealous. This scene shows how Dasha is already politically conscious and vocalizing her liberation, claiming herself as agent, whereas Gleb still exhibits aspects of an untamed pre-revolutionary self. This is important because it demonstrates how Dasha does not struggle internally and has no need for character development, reaffirming her as a secondary and supportive force in the narrative. Gleb, on the other hand, has much to learn and develop as a character. He must overcome his longing for traditionalism in order to achieve political consciousness so that he can be a productive member of society. He must internally transform as a person. This tension between them pushes Gleb to begin his ritualized journey, with Dasha's ability and mothering functioning as a mirror for Gleb to see his own self-reflection. Notably, slight progress emerges the following morning before Gleb ventures to visit Nurka, his daughter, at the children's home. He explains that he knows that Dasha has changed and she is a mix between her old and new self. He then claims that the same notion is true about his own self and suggests we shall learn. Since Dasha's first rejection of him and her explanation of how she sees Soviet ideology apply in private life, he is displaying some aptitude for communist thinking within the private sphere. A few chapters later, though, we see Gleb stumble as his yearning for conventional private life interferes with his success in the public life. This is necessary as the novel focuses on and traces the transformation of the positive hero. In contrast to Gleb, Dasha is a static character, and her main function in the novel is to assist Gleb in his transformation to ideal subjecthood. Gleb attends a party committee meeting to propose restoring the cement factory. His request is full of passionate socialist rhetoric. At the end of the meeting, Gladkov, a committee party member, comes to Gleb and notifies him that they are going to take his proposal into consideration. While this should be seen as a victory for Gleb, he becomes consumed with jealousy. Once more, Gleb felt the other's words and gaze were stabbing him deep. Dasha, Gladkov, were Gladkov perhaps the answer to his confusing puzzle? This moment illustrates how Gleb cannot be productively committed to the cement project, his public life, when he is obsessing over Dasha and if Gladkov were her lover. This scene in the novel demonstrates the transformation of one's views and behavior in the private sphere is more challenging for Gleb than transformation in the public life. The peak of Gleb's destructive spontaneity occurs when he pleads with Dasha to tell him what happened between her and Kleist, an engineer and Gleb's arch nemesis. She announces that she has had sexual encounters with more than one other man. In an enraged state, Gleb flung himself at Dasha, his fists raised. Dasha responds, "I wanted to test you, Gleb. You cannot behave like a man. You cannot listen to me yet as you should. You're a good soldier, but in ordinary life you're a bad communist." While we observe Gleb's spontaneity explode, we also see Dasha in her most edifying role. She explicitly deems herself as a catalyst for his spontaneity and declares that he will not be fully conscious until he conquers it. By positioning herself as examiner, she reiterates her function as a wise maternal figure. In this scene, as elsewhere, neither readers nor Gleb have access to Dasha's inner world. There is no explanation or character development in the novel that would account for Dasha's views and actions, which only confirms her secondary status in the novel. We see Gleb begin to deter his quest to retain Dasha as his traditional wife. When he encounters Kleist, Kleist wholeheartedly believes Gleb is going to kill him because of what he has done to Gleb and Dasha in the past. Astonishing Kleist, Gleb does not discuss the past and only speaks about the factory and its requirements. He states, "We've acted the fool long enough. We need heads, not hands. We're going to start things going." He is able to put aside his personal fury with Kleist for the benefit of the factory, thereby exhibiting greater political consciousness. He is moving forward on his ritualized journey. As Gleb continues to make headway at the factory, he attempts to conquer his desire for a traditional marriage and household. The correlation between the two is unmistakable, as the more he fights off urges for a traditional home life, the more productive he is in reestablishing the cement factory. After Dasha returns home, beaten and exhausted from surrendering herself to the Cossacks for the safety of Baden, she tells him the story. The narrative greatly moves Gleb. He promises to never force himself on her or to reproach her again. She even teasingly inquires whether he would be able to keep his cool if she were to tell him that she had slept with Baden. This appears as another one of Dasha's tests. Gleb reflects. Her words were a blow, but it did not hurt. In the last days, has his jealousy burned itself out, or had Dasha become something more than a wife to him? His heart felt only tenderness towards her, as towards a new friend whom he had not known before. This scene further exemplifies Gleb's movement ahead on his ritualized journey to absolute political consciousness and Dasha's necessary role as maternal nurturer, always pushing him forward towards self-improvement. He is beginning to demonstrate Soviet consciousness in his private life. His ability to overcome his spontaneity only works to make him more effective in saving the cement factory, as he is able to forgive and work with Kleist, stop dwelling on Dasha's possible other sexual encounters, and fight off an attack from the Cossacks. Moreover, his victory over the Cossacks once more validates how Dasha functions as a catalyst to measure and foster Gleb's success as an ideal Soviet citizen. After the triumph over the Cossacks, Dasha, for only a moment, places her hand on his shoulders, approving his actions. Toward the end of the novel, when the factory is about to open, Gleb has one of his last meetings with Dasha. This encounter shows that Gleb is close to achieving political consciousness. She informs him that she is moving out of their house so she can help take care of Polya, who was recently assaulted by Baden. Dasha's decision situates her maternal role in the novel, yet it also shows her determination to evade the possibility of men, Gleb, acting on their sexual desires, as Gleb's libido brings about his urge for conventionalism. Gleb is confused by this, but eventually accepts. She again explains her liberation and declines his advances. Gleb is rather ambivalent about this, yet in the end he appears to understand Dasha's choice. As Dasha makes her exit, Mochia, another woman character, reproaches Gleb for his unaffectedness by Dasha's departure. He explains that everything is fine and that we're going to build everything up. She counters that he has destroyed his home. He disputes her claim by stating, "What then? We'll build a new one, Mochia. If the old home has been destroyed, it means that the old home wasn't good." These determinative words highlight Gleb's transformation and near completion of his ritualized journey. He has accepted that his previous conventional life with Dasha was defective. Yet this never would have been possible without Dasha's decision to move out, stability, and guidance. Here it is obvious how throughout the novel, Dasha operated as an other for bringing about a new self in Gleb. The only time we gain true insight into Gleb's mind is when she questions her decision to place Nurka in the creche. But this hesitation primarily serves as an example of devout maternalism. While Soviet society requires service from both men and women, the nature of the service differs, and in a sense, greater demands are placed on women. While this largely does, as we see with Dasha and more broadly with socialist realist novels, is that women are hardly ever placed at the center of Soviet society. Men always take this position. Gleb's ritualized journey is not finalized in this pivotal event, but it does show his progression toward near completion. Soon after, Gleb, Dasha, Baden, and other workers are in the factory. Baden is elected chairman of the District Economic Council. Gleb is strongly displeased with Baden's appointment because of how he treated Polya and Dasha. Gleb causes a scene and interjects, "I have objected and shall again object to the proposals of Comrade Baden and Lukova." Dasha intervenes and tells him to calm down, but Gleb is incapable of doing so in this episode. He repeatedly thinks of Dasha and Baden being intimate and goes on to call Baden a son of a bitch. Responding to his outburst, Dasha grabs him by the shoulder and explains, "Gleb, have you gone mad? Have you lost your sense? Gleb, shame yourself, Gleb." Baden reproaches Gleb and claims that his jealousy is inappropriate. Dasha, though, defends Gleb to a degree by arguing that he did not have the right to speak with Baden in that tone, but he is a good worker, just like Baden. And finally she states, "These damn men, they're always ready to fight over a trifle, but when they're at work, they're like iron." Gleb's spontaneity and conventional desires cause him to forget the purpose of the meeting, yet with Dasha's intervention, Gleb is able to subdue his disorderliness. The opening of the cement factory is a decisive moment when Gleb completes his ritualized journey. On opening day, Gleb arrives and sees thousands of people and feels as though Dasha is lost in the crowd. This is a sign, perhaps, that he is now capable of not desiring a conventional wife, as Dasha is no longer a priority to him. While this is not necessarily good for Dasha, it is for the Soviet state, as it gained economically at the expense of Gleb's devaluation of his private life. However, Gleb is not happy in this moment because he must stand near Baden and watch him present a speech to the crowd. As he observes Baden speak, he recalls his final encounter of Dasha, which allows him to avoid the dangers of his spontaneity. Before opening day, he visits the home of Polya. She was grappling with the trauma of being assaulted by Baden and asked him to leave. But before Gleb departed, he spoke with Dasha one last time. Dasha was rather ambivalent and unemotional. He inquired when she would return home, and she informed him that she was staying with Polya. This was the trigger for Gleb, and he interrupted. Baden is a worthless scoundrel and bandit. I shall fix him when the time comes. He gobbled up both you and Mefova. Dasha replied, "You must think with your brain and not with your body. Comrade Baden is no more responsible for this than you are. Remember that." Gleb retorted that he was now alone after giving himself fully to the factory. Sagaciously, Dasha answered, "The old life has perished and will not return. We must build up a new life. The time will come when we shall build ourselves new homes. Love will always be love, but it requires a new form. Everything will come through and attain new forms, and then we shall know how to forge new links." Gleb then left, but stumbled across Baden. He wanted to have Baden shot. Not surprisingly, Dasha was there again to tell him to leave, to shield him from the dangers of his own self. After having this recollection, Gleb is able to go on stage with Baden and give a speech. It is in this way that Gleb is able to complete his ritualized journey. Before he goes on stage, he questions his capacity to stand next to Baden, but after recalling his last meeting with Dasha and her encouraging words, he is able to walk across the stage and stand next to him. By calming and instructing Gleb, Dasha has endlessly worked to take care of Gleb and help him recover from his anger and frustration. She insistently prompted him to realize how their old life did not align with the current, and he needed to act with new ideological purposes in mind and not with his body. In many ways, these last scenes between Dasha and Gleb show how Dasha's guidance makes Gleb a better worker, an ideal Soviet citizen. As just mentioned, she accomplishes this by rejecting his sexual advances and by informing him to not think of his body. Essentially, she equates the body, sexual desire, with their old traditional life and by extension, Soviet ideology with the brain. From here, it is evident that, to some degree, sexual desire and productivity in the workforce conflict with one another in the Soviet project. This is seen throughout the novel, when Dasha constantly reprimands Gleb for his jealousy and fights off advances because they hold him back from attaining communist principles. Gleb's outbursts persistently clash with his productivity in renovating the factory, and Dasha decides to move out of their home, a literal separation of genders, to avoid the possibility of acting on his impulses. Along these lines, Cement understands Soviet ideology by way of the Soviet imaginary propagating man as subject who productively contributes in society due to the nurturing of woman and at the expense of sexual desire. We should also understand Dasha's role as other as something that rejects traditional love for the sake of productivity, and not only because she curbs Gleb's sensuality. Her otherness exceedingly translated into motherhood. Maternalism is at play throughout the novel. We can see this in the identification of the precious woman's space and in Dasha's incessant ideological mothering of Gleb. It appears that woman's primary role in the Soviet imaginary, as depicted in Cement, is that of a mother. But this is a new type of motherhood, where women not only nurture their biological children, but anyone in need of maternal care. Motherhood is viewed as necessary in Dasha's chief contribution in the novel. What's more, Dasha is only a problem for Gleb in his private life. She, for the most part, does not interact with him in the public sphere, in the actual restoration and opening of the factory. While she does at first affect his ability to perform digitally in the beginning of the novel, it is only because she has caused an upsurge in his personal life. Nevertheless, she relentlessly mothers him so that he can be a productive worker. While she is mobilized as a Soviet citizen, her mobilization is shaped in accordance with the need of Soviet society to transform its primary subjects, men. Gleb's progress on his ritualized journey is made possible by Dasha's subservient role in the novel. It's in this way that we can understand there are two different gendered paths to membership in the Soviet community shown in Cement. First, Soviet woman as the maternal other, whose role is shaped in accordance with men's needs, and two, Soviet man as subject, whose development as a productive worker and citizen depends on the secondary position of women. By returning Anderson to the discussion, it is easy to see how these gendered pathways, which consist of Soviet man as subject and Soviet woman as other, function to construct the Soviet imagined community. While gender roles are made palpable from the novel's usage of national gendered landscapes, the factory, the Kirsch, or for that matter, the Women's Committee, they are also made visible in the narrative's gendered interconnectivity. Characters connect with one another in specified ways that is determined by gender. Readers learn how to partake in society from these structures in the novel. From here, it is necessary to take into consideration the narrative's portrayal of Dasha as an instrument for bringing about Gleb's transformation because, as Clark asserts, the socialist realist novel educates readers on how to contribute to society and, by extension, indoctrinates them in Soviet ideology. It's important to note that Dasha is a liberated woman, as Durfee argues, because she rejects the traditional family, embraces radical social and political viewpoints, and works. However, Dasha is not liberated in terms of social relations. Pavel Vesla takes note of this ambiguity in women's liberation in her article, The Hardening of Cement, as she argues, the Bolsheviks did defend the family at the same time as they feared it, always trying to subject it to the control of the state and make it inferior to the larger family fathered by Lenin, Stalin, Khrushchev, and other Soviet leaders. Ultimately, Vesla finds women's liberation to be contradictory. This contradiction is exemplified in Cement, as women readers not only conceptualize Dasha's liberation in the public sphere, but they also internalize gendered interconnectivity in national geographies and Dasha's subordinate position in the novel, her maternal role as necessary. The socialist realist novel produces a more explicit form of the imagined community than what Anderson discusses, as the representation of this community is imbued with the narrative's didactic spirit, the interweaving of characters' interconnectivity in national spaces with gendered trajectories that promote productivity and the repression of sexual desire. Cement was written very early on in the Soviet era, when changes in the gender politics were only beginning to take root. As a novel that served as a model for later socialist realist texts, Cement laid dubious gender foundations for the imagining of Soviet society. As Wood correctly notes, the Soviet state was mostly interested in women and the women question, if it were for the state's benefit. It did not fundamentally alter conventional gender relations. Ultimately, women, although liberated to some extent, were not at the heart of Soviet society. Rather, they were secondary caregivers whose traditional mothering role was reshaped by the state for its own purposes, both political and economic. That's it.